I wanted to come on here and record, something a bit different because I'm doing this as a form of documentation within just my own journey, striving to become the best version of myself, right? 2.0. I always talk about it, always preach it. But I recently came to a revelation, right? To and that's really putting it lightly, in that, you know, when it comes to how much I've been able to achieve thus far within, the past 1.5 years, essentially, since coming out of the worst, point of my life, right, where I, wholeheartedly believe that was it for me, right, where that was rock bottom, you know, considering the negative, you know, thoughts I would get on a regular basis, the mental health issues, the lack of confidence, the lack of independence, the lack of just my own identity, right? Who I was fundamentally, I'd lost that. And of course, I'll probably touch up on this in, a separate video in the future, going more in depth on that, but that's not the focus. Right now, the focus is documenting and holding myself accountable to this revelation that I received in terms of how everything all relates back to the spiritual, right? Of course, I talk a lot about, aligning yourself across the physical, the mental, the spiritual, but wholeheartedly, the, the spiritual is the pinnacle. It is what everybody is striving to achieve, whether they, are consciously aware of it or not, because the journey towards, your best self, your 2.0, it starts off on the physical. It goes up to the mental, and then climaxes, it peaks at the spiritual. It's like a triangle, right? It's like a triangle in that you start off physical, mental, spiritual, and then from there you go back down to the mental and the physical. Because once you become so in tune with who you are fundamentally and just with a higher power, a higher being, something greater than yourself, you then begin to, it's almost like you re-inject yourself into the world with just a, such a deeper sense of clarity and purpose. And as a result, your thoughts and your actions naturally just, they click, because it's all aligned towards who you are fundamentally, your heart, your soul, your spirit, however you want to conceptualize it. And that, to me, is how any form of success comes into fruition, is that it has to all tie back to who you are fundamentally, and just your inner self, your inner being. And so the revelation I got whilst, taking this walk not too long ago after my first meal was, in honesty, it was also a part of a video I was watching of this guy who I resonate with a lot and respect in terms of what he's been able to achieve success wise within, an endeavor that I'm, currently in pursuit of, not necessarily, but, similarly. And it made me recall what essentially liberated me from those negative feelings, those negative emotions that I was going through when I was at, rock bottom, right? When I was at the worst point of my life. And sure, I was still hitting the gym, I was reading, all these books on like personal development and improving your mindset and the way you look at the world. But for me, I realized the most important thing that I did back then was I started leaning more on my faith. Right? This was before I really began to understand the importance of authenticity, and even before I really understood spirituality in the way that I do now. And essentially what I did was I started praying way more. I started praying more because I just felt so hopeless. You can't help but just feel like relying on something bigger than yourself. But when you get to that point in your life, you realize you can't rely on anybody else. You cannot rely on a mere human or just an object or anything within this world. You cannot rely on that in order to experience that salvation and liberation. And so it made me confront my own relationship with God and realize that it's like I was so dependent on all of these other things except for him. And so once I began to start praying so consistently and really leaning on my faith, it's funny because then it was almost as if things got worse. But it wasn't worse in the sense of my life inherently became worse, but it was almost like more and more things were being almost thrown at me to almost pull me away from this intention, this newly realized intention of wanting to lean more into my faith. And as a result, it was hard because it was like I was trying to step into this new identity, but I was constantly being pulled away from that, by constantly being reminded of what essentially put me into that worst position of my life. Right, just constantly, being reminded of that because, of course, I was still in high school at the time, and it's especially hard when you're trying to create this new identity for yourself, but everybody around you, right, even friends that you value, it's like they still see you as that old identity. They still see you for who you are essentially trying to escape from. And so it doesn't help at all when the opinions and the judgments that are had of you, that people have of you, it doesn't help at all when you're trying to do something like that, when you're trying to lean into a new sense of worth within yourself. And once I began praying and once I began, learning to get better and better at dealing with those almost like these tests, right? I've spoken about that before on the channel, the tests of this world. Once I got better at that, it allowed me to then lean more and more into my faith. And what especially helped was when I graduated from high school, because of course then I was able to shake off all of the opinions, the judgments, all of these things. And consequently, I was also put into a state of isolation where I lost a lot of the connections and friendships that I'd had. But looking back, it was for the better because those weren't really the friendships and the connections that were deeper and actually meaningful. Because after I graduated high school, I really only had like 3 close friends, plus my family, of course. And I would say that those were the actual meaningful relationships within my life. And as a result, I could embrace who I was and my own faith so much more. And if you guys have seen the summer transformation video I made, which this is part of what led me to this revelation, was that back then it wasn't, as I mentioned, it wasn't the fact that I was running and lifting, it wasn't the fact that I was reading these books, but it was that summer where I began to lean so much more into my faith, and I started reading the Bible specifically. And by the end of that year, I had essentially read the entirety of the Bible. But of course it doesn't stop there, because in reading the Bible, it not only allowed me to get such a deeper understanding of who God was and how he operates, and the things that he promises within the lives of those who obviously look up to him, but it then enabled me to learn more about spirituality and understand it better. Things like, manifestation and what it means to truly live an authentic, fulfilling lifestyle and how to align yourself to that. That's when I really began to understand and comprehend these things on a much deeper level. But something I failed to realize was that along the way, learning all of these things, I got lost. I got a bit, sidetracked within, of course, just, worldly pursuits, as does anybody. And it's led me up until now where, of course, I've been striving a lot towards improving my health, my fitness, where I started this whole content thing. And obviously, I'm probably going to make a video explaining my new sort of intention with the channel. Not that it's changed, necessarily from when I first started, but it's almost like laying the foundation for how I want to actually, for what I want this channel to be, as a means of documenting, just, being pure documentation of my journey towards 2.0. And it made me realize that in the same way that I'm disciplined within, my health, my fitness, I need to be that much more disciplined within the mental aspects of life, and even more so the spiritual. And it's what separates that version of me from, a year ago to the me now, where I was disciplined across all the aspects in terms of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. But now it's almost like I'm primarily disciplined within the health and the fitness aspects. And of course, it's a good thing, right? It's not to take away from that, because I'm obviously pursuing it with good intentions and from an authentic, standpoint. But, part of 2.0 is alignment, right? It's congruence across all three of these things: your mind, your body, and your soul. And so it made me realize that I was neglecting the mental and the spiritual aspects of this journey, and that I was almost convincing myself that, I'm putting in some effort and time into this, but when I think how disciplined I am within health and fitness, it doesn't compare, right? And it made me realize that it's like how I achieve success in one thing is how I should be able to achieve success in everything. And if I can achieve success in fitness and health the way that I envision, then it's like I need to, reciprocate that within developing myself mentally and spiritually. And so I've decided that I need to lean more into my own faith, into just, diving into the depths of my being, really beginning to understand myself on such an intricate level, to the point where it's like I just have such clarity as to what actually matters within my life. And as a result, my thoughts begin to align with this deeper sense of being, this purpose. Because what I feel like I was doing was that, within the journey, as I mentioned, it climaxes at the spiritual. And then once you really nail down the spiritual, everything, it comes downhill within the mental and the physical, more so the physical, where I truly believe, obtaining any material success, you must first, master your inner being, in terms of knowing exactly how you operate, knowing who you are fundamentally. And what I felt was the case was that I had already gone past the pinnacle, and that I was already, it was already coming downhill for me. But it was a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake on my part, in that I still have so much to learn, so much to, dive into within the spiritual before I can confidently, say that everything is beginning to come downhill in terms of, developing myself within the mental and the physical. And it's why I need to take a step back. And it's not necessarily to say that, oh, I'm gonna stop, caring about the fitness and health aspects, right? Health 2.0, that's of course extremely meaningful to me, but I need to take a step back and reframe how I view my own spiritual journey, within my relationship with God, within, just knowing myself, right? Know thyself. That, to me, that's something that stood out to me a lot within the past few months. And it's something that I've truthfully failed to really embrace. It's one of those things where it's like I know and I'm aware of it, but I don't actively apply it. And it's the same with my relationship with, Christ, where it's like I know, how important, God's presence is, how much it served me within my life, but it's like I don't live in accordance to that. I don't actively strive to apply it in the way that I should, and it's that, and that is the real revelation, right? That is the real revelation and the real reason why I was able to, ascend from that extreme low point within my life. And so now, it just feels like that clarity is beginning to rise, right? That clarity is beginning to come back within me, the same level or a similar level that I had back then, in terms of just, realizing what actually mattered within my life and how it was able to take me out of such a low point and into this position that I am now. Right? It was all through tapping into that inner part of me that had, yet to be discovered prior to experiencing that low point. And I made the mistake of thinking I was past that, but I'm not. I'm still there, or I'm still at the pinnacle in terms of the spiritual. And so I need to continue working on that above all else, right? And as I mentioned, it doesn't mean I'm going to neglect the physical or the spiritual. It just means that I have to ensure that everything is aligned. I have to ensure that I just nail down the spiritual. And I'm not making it seem like it's this goal or this, this box I have to check. It's truthfully something that, it's always, it's everlasting. It's something that's always being done, or that should always be being done. And that's what I fail to realize. And so I need to just be more disciplined, more intentional within that. And I know as a result, anything that I'm pursuing and striving for will just happen. Right? I spoke about how I believe fitness is the vehicle towards aligning myself across the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and I still believe that is the case, but my relationship with God, it doesn't even need to be, said that is the thing that is most, imperative, right? It doesn't even need to be this thing where it's like, oh no, yeah, God is the vehicle. It's just, it's a non-negotiable, right? At least the way I see it, and I haven't been treating it like a non-negotiable. And so moving forward, I'm just going to be so much more intentional within that. And I wanted to come on here and hold myself accountable to that. And, even if anybody else resonates with this, and, also holding you guys accountable, because I feel like this is something that a lot of people struggle with, where they're so caught up in these worldly pursuits that they fail to realize that it all originates from, here. It all originates from within, from the spirit, from God. That's where it all comes from. And so I wanted to document this as a means of, setting a new foundation for what I'm actively trying to achieve, and, even the direction of this channel. And I'm sure I'll make another video, speaking a bit more on my new approach that I'm coming up with. And I can't help but believe that this is genuinely the right thing to do at this point in time, where, you know, for the longest time, I this was something I desired a lot, being able to come on here and just talk, just let out my thoughts and not even really think twice about it, and just, you know, be able to consider myself, like somebody who posts, content. And now that I'm here, I realize that, of course, I'm trying to take it as far as I possibly can and make it something that I can genuinely achieve freedom through. But I need to, stay grounded within the fact that God is the one who dictates that. And that it's like, sure, I can, be in pursuit all I want, but if God isn't in pursuit of this thing alongside me, then it's all going to be for nothing. It's simply a waste of time then. And so I need to take a step back and reevaluate my priorities. And so this video is essentially me holding myself to such a high standard within that regard, to the point where the spiritual will be this thing that I don't give up on, I don't let up on, and that it's something that I do not neglect. It's something that is an absolute priority, non-negotiable within my day-to-day, because I know that as a result, and it's not necessarily because I know if I do this and I'm gonna get all the success. I think that it is the case to a certain degree, but I know that more than anything, it allows me to actively surrender my desires, surrender, the day-to-day emotions, the feelings, right? The things that are part of the mental and the physical, and to instead just take the time to relax in the presence of God, relax into who I am fundamentally, because I know that through that is where the best ideas come. That is where the best insights, the best solutions, that is where the path is illuminated. And so that's pretty much that. Wanted to hold myself accountable within this, documenting this, because, in the end, it's part of the journey. It's absolutely part of the journey. And I know that in time I'd be able to look back on this video and even feel a sense of, joy and fulfillment, seeing that this was the choice that I made, and how it eventually, God willing, eventually results in the success and freedom that I want out of this life. Yeah, that's pretty much it. But as I mentioned, I'll drop a new video explaining where I truly want to take the channel, because I feel like I've been half-assing it. And I'm beginning to develop conviction within the fact that this is how I will, change my life in the way that I actually want to, and not just it be something that I think I want, but that I know I want. But appreciate it if you guys saw the whole thing through, man. So I would super appreciate any thoughts, insights, comments, within this regard, because I feel like this is something, super meaningful to me. And obviously, I essentially just poured out what, is in my head in this very moment. And I'm really just trying to build something bigger than myself here. But I know that in order to do that, I need to actively look towards something bigger than myself, and that is just what's in here and in God. But see y'all. Good things are to come, baby. Good things are absolutely on the way.